second keynote. The great number of references in the papers of this conference to your award-winning book on priceless markets shows that Phil actually does not need any formal introduction. I take it short. But this book co-authored with Jean-Laurent Rosenthal and Gilles Postel-Vinet. I don't know how to pronounce Rosenthal in French, actually. Rosenthal. Rosenthal, yeah. This book is a classic today, unavoidable for anyone doing research in financial institutions and credit markets before modern banking. So, what do Swedes know about Phil Hoffman? Yes, you are a professor at Cortec.
Yeah.
You are educated at Yale. You had your PhD there, but you had also the BA in Harvard. You have gone around from the east to the west. And what do I don't know? Well, I didn't know that you have received the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship in Humanities.
Okay.
Congratulations afterwards. It was some years ago.
Okay.
And you have written a book about church and community in a French town called Lyon. I didn't know that either.
That was back when I was a social historian.
It was maybe the PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, it was in the beginning of the 80s. Today you will introduce us to a new book, written by the same priceless markets triumvirate, forthcoming in next year, Dark Matter Credit, the development of peer-to-peer lending and banking in France. I guess I have some suspicion that you want to show us that the French credit system was as effective as the British one and the Italian one and the one in the Low Countries, despite the fact that banking institutions developed much later. So, welcome, Phil. We are all ears.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Håkan, for inviting me. This is a wonderful conference, and I've heard wonderful papers, Carol's wonderful address. I'll try and equal the rest of these wonderful papers. And you may say, oh, no, you're giving us more of this same stuff. We may have been, you've inflicted this first book on us, now a second one. Is it that the three of you are obsessed with credit? I guess so. This is a project that began almost 30 years ago. I remember watching television from Gilles Postel-Vinet's living room. I think Yeltsin had been deposed, was it threatened in the former Soviet Union. My younger daughter was about to arrive. Anyway, that was early in the project. So it continues. But anyway, today I want to talk about this because it's relevant to a number of the things we've spoken about, to what I'm going to call peer-to-peer lending. What has appeared here is informal lending, all sorts of things. The kind I'm going to talk about is mortgage lending. And we discussed this in our book, Priceless Markets, and then we decided, for reasons I'll explain, to look at the entire country and to estimate how big this was on a national scale for the entire country. And we wanted to do this in France. It was, we thought, important for some reasons I'll get to. And important because France is often thought of as being late to develop banking. We also redid the history of French banking in France. And it turns out that France was not underbanked. There were many more banks than economic historians have thought. The numbers they give are off by an order of magnitude. And we did some research to get this. So that's what I'm going to talk about. We gathered data on nearly 250,000 loans throughout France, specifically in about 100 villages, towns, cities scattered through the country. There they are, and new data on the number of banks. So why do this? There are, I think, let's start with a sort of assumptions that economic historians make. And that is that a robust financial system is essential for economic growth. There's a lot of evidence behind this. The evidence comes from macroeconomics, from cross-country regressions by well-known scholars such as Ross Levine, by economic historians back to Alex Gerschenkron. There's evidence from development economics today that if you can combine, in some sense, banking, you can give people in developing countries a savings account plus some assets, a loan or a grant, and then a third thing, some training. The three together really help raise per capita income. You have to do all three. They complement one another. Each one is necessary. Now, in this process of financial development, it's long been thought that banks are very important. You have to have banks. Informal lending, who has? It's got to be, banks are important. Stock markets, too. But banks are particularly important for making payments, for financing businesses, and so on. This is widely accepted, but if so, it raises a question. Why was much of Western Europe rich even in 1750? What's the evidence for that? Take real wages. Real wages in the German city of Leipzig were 42% higher than in Shanghai, one of the wealthiest cities in China. And they were higher still than in Japan or Japanese or Indian cities. Paris real wages were 55–60% higher in 1750 than in Shanghai. And they were higher still, as we well know, in Amsterdam or London. You may say, well, that's real wages. What about GDP per capita? GDP per capita, it's hard to get, but in the Netherlands, very wealthy, circa 1820, was nearly double what it was in the Yangtze Delta, one of the wealthiest parts of China. So a lot of Western Europe, not just Amsterdam and England, were rich in 1750. But in most of Western Europe, there were very few banks, particularly outside of large cities. If banks are a necessary condition for higher incomes, how did you get high per capita incomes in Western Europe without banks? And we thought, well, that's a mystery. And France is a particularly good place to look because it has long been considered to have been underbanked. All right? So the answer to that question is that there was a lot of peer-to-peer lending. That's the modern term for loans between individuals. It's informal credit and so on and so forth. The sort of lending that Maria talked about and that Matteo talked about and so on and so forth. There was enough of this so that 1/3 of French families, we estimate, could borrow back in 1740 using this system. The amount of outstanding debt, this was by and large mortgage lending, and we're leaving out other kinds of informal lending. And we'd argue that the mortgage debt, if you look at the stock of debt, was actually the bulk of it. It was, in 1840, about 27% of GDP. That's large. It's comparable to mortgage debt in the United States in the 1950s, which was 31%. And this was all outside the banking system. No banks were making mortgage or originating mortgage loans. And we know that this kind of shadow lending was large elsewhere. Hoken's own work. There's a different kind of lending going on in Amsterdam. That's linked to the financial markets. Large. But if you look even as late as 1900, between 1/3 and 2/3 of mortgage debt in the United States, the United Kingdom, or Germany originated outside the banking system. So France was not unusual, but this raised a big problem. How could you get so much mortgage lending, so much lending, given the risk that borrowers would default and that their collateral that had been mortgaged would turn out to be worth less than you thought? You may say, well, that doesn't happen. Yes, it does. Think of 2008. Worthless collateral. In the jargon of economics, this is the problem of asymmetric information. the lender doesn't know as much about the creditworthiness of the borrower or about the value of the borrower's collateral as the borrower himself or herself knows. All right? Now, contemporaries were fully aware of this problem, and long before our sampling begins. One of the best discussions is in the early 17th century by a well-known French lawyer Loiseau, who's complaining about the difficulty of getting any sort of guarantee of repayment for perpetual annuities. A major problem, he claimed, because many families had defaulted after having been impoverished during the 16th century wars of religion in France. So somehow this problem was solved. And it was solved in France. And I'm not saying this particular specific solution generalizes. The problem generalizes to all credit markets. And it's solved in various ways. But in France, in the mortgage market, it was solved by notaries. Notaries were essentially officials at tax court who also had a private business drawing up contracts. But they provided legal advice and financial advice, and they get into the business of matching up borrowers and lenders and making these peer-to-peer loans possible. Given a borrower, they'd find a lender, and so on. But in addition, if they couldn't find, say, a lender in their own business, from their own set of clients, they'd refer the borrower to another notary and vouch for the borrower's creditworthiness and the value of the borrower's collateral. In other words, they were sharing information with one another. They could also dispatch lenders, say, here, someone else has got a good borrower, I trust that other notary. Repeat dealings, not between borrowers and lenders, but between the notaries themselves, kept them honest and made sure that their recommendations were valuable, that their standard of creditworthiness and the value of collateral meant something. The interesting thing is, and I won't talk very much about this today, is that this solution via notaries, which happens in some other places, in Latin America where notaries exist, it grows out of Roman law, out of civil law. And that is a big surprise if you follow the legal literature on what's called legal origins. And the argument in this literature, which is supported by a lot of econometric evidence, but has been undermined by lots of studies, including some by economic historians, is that if you're cursed with Roman law or civil law, it's going to hold back financial development. And what we find is actually the reverse. And there are more examples that I won't talk about. There's innovation, which is supposed to be very difficult with civil law. So you have a general problem that afflicts all credit markets, but a specific solution. The same specific solution applies in other places, Latin America, for instance, but not in others. There could be other ways to solve. Village clerks in Germany, attorneys in Britain. Any case, so we studied that, we worked out this solution, and we also showed that France was not underbanked. It had far more banks than has long been thought. And the bank lending is not as if there are more banks. They appear in the 19th century. They enter all kinds of markets. This is a graph of banks per préfecture. That's the biggest city in a département. France is divided into about 100 of these. And you can see that by about 1840, every département has got a bank. Smaller jurisdictions, cantons, which are about a dozen villages or a town and some villages. Yeah, and by the end of the century, nearly half of them, or well over a third of them, have a bank. These were unit banks, as in the United States. A bank without branches, by and large, early on. The banks with branches then follow late in the century, universal banks and so on. there were loads of banks and there were no barriers to entry. Banks could set up just about anywhere in France. There were myths that it was very difficult to set up a bank in France, and it's just not true. So we investigate that. We have new data on banking, and it uses a source, a historical source, that other historians at other European countries could use. The same for the source we use for the lending. I'll get to that, or might be able to use. And this sort of peer-to-peer lending thrived until the early 20th century. What made it disappear? It was killed off by government intervention, not competition from the banks. When banks entered a market, it didn't reduce peer-to-peer lending. It, in fact, increased it. And France was not, as I said, atypical. There were parallels in other countries, at least as late as 1900. Again, the brokers are different. The one thing we might suspect is that this peer-to-peer lending actually lagged in Britain. And as a result, banks may have done more of the sort of lending we're seeing here. And Britain may be overbanked. Think of the banks as it doesn't have enough of these. It doesn't have notaries, given the legal system. So it develops more banks. And we compare Britain's banking, or the United Kingdom's banking as a whole, with French banking. We gathered data on banking in Britain to do that. And we wonder if there are parallels in developing countries. Could so-called traditional sources of credit be very large? If so, then a lot of these regressions are giving erroneous results. So we wanted to measure, we set out to see how this problem was solved and to measure this peer-to-peer lending for France as a whole. You may say, well, why do this since you already showed it was big in Paris? Well, Paris is strange. We had all these local studies that said it was big, but Paris is strange. It's full of wealthy savers. Notaries were arranging loans in Paris, but they're all within the same city. They interacted a lot. It was easy for them to pass information to one another. What happens if you're out in the countryside and the nearest notary is 10 or 20 kilometers away? How do you refer a borrower? What happens there? Was Paris unique? There might be, not as many savers, certainly not in small towns and villages. So we wanted to see that, and we wanted to estimate this peer-to-peer lending for the entire country. And the way we did this is we took advantage of a tax. The tax is a tax that was created by Louis XIV, called the Contrôle des Actes. And then it continues after the French Revolution in a very similar form. It's known as the enregistrement. It's in a sense a tax on, it's a stamp tax, a little tax on contracts. Things like this exist elsewhere, or similar, or sources that might be different but could give you similar information. Perhaps the wealth tax in Sweden. I don't know. There are historical sources that would give you information about loans. What this tax did was a tax on transactions, on loans, land sales, all sorts of things, wills. And the tax records here, for example, include all kinds of documents. Down here is a loan, an obligation, a promissory note, by a Lyon lawyer and merchant. And they owed someone named Pierre Pelissou a certain sum of money. Here's the record that records it. It's a lot faster to go through these tax records than to read the loan documents, which are preserved in the notarial records. You could read that. We read a lot of notarial records in Paris, but we don't have a budget big enough to hire enough researchers to read them for. Our core sample, we had a stratified sample of about 100 markets scattered through France. We had Paris, some other big cities like Lyon and Rouen, because there's a lot, loans were much bigger in cities. And then we had a bunch of villages, okay, or towns. We oversampled the city. Well, We wanted to compensate for the fact that loans were much bigger in cities, and we adjusted our sample accordingly. And what we did is we'd go into a département, having chosen, say, a city there, we'd do the city, do some medium and smaller villages, since we were already there, take photographs of the tax records, and we did this for 1740. That's about as far back as you can go, because although the taxes created in the late 17th century, the offices are all set up and working until the early 18th century. We did it for 1740, 1780, 1807, 1840, 1865, and 1899. You may say, well, why don't you do it every 10 years? Well, we got a limited budget. We wanted to do a little more than a generation between each act. We wanted to avoid some of the worst of the French Revolution. 1899 was as late as we could go when we started this project. So we did that, and we also gathered new data on banks. So anyway, back to this. Something similar like this could be done in other countries if the tax exists or something like it. And then we also did samples in the notarial records to verify some things, but smaller samples. We also gathered data on banks for Britain and France using guides. These guides are published throughout Europe. We thought for a while of doing Germany as well. They exist. But these guides tell you, for all, throughout France, a number of things, including they have a list of bankers and négociants. They're sort of like wholesale merchants, but they often do banking. So you can go through. And you have to think about what's compiled in these guys. Think about them as a historical source. But they will give you a list of banks beginning in the early 19th century. So we did that for Britain, for the United Kingdom as a whole. For France, we gave up on Germany because I would have had to do it. I'm the German speaker, and I didn't have time. So, or my co-authors dissuaded me from doing that. So we have 3 topics today that I want to talk about. I want to talk, there's a lot more in the book. There's more about the data, there are economic models, there's more on banking, and more on this effect of this civil law, which has been exaggerated, I think. And I want to talk at length about how this problem of asymmetric information was solved. How did lenders find creditworthy borrowers with valuable collateral? They didn't. We're going to show you that it's highly unlikely that they knew one another. Collateral alone is not a solution because its value varies over time. Hard to assess its value if it's in a distant place. If there's an unknown second mortgage, first mortgage that you didn't know about, that could raise the loan-to-value ratio. There was no effective registry of liens, of mortgages, before government registry before the late 1800s. That's a problem. Notaries had all the loans and knew roughly what was the value of previous mortgages, but that means you had to go through a notary. I'm going to talk about that problem. I'm going to talk about the bank-notary interaction, but I won't go into detail. There's a lot more in the book. And then I want to talk about something at the end. The loans in this market were all at 5%. It's a ration market. That often happens in credit markets where there are problems like this. The amount of loan was limited by the value of the collateral and the creditworthiness of the borrower. And you'd make so much, you'd lend so much at 5%. There are reasons why you wouldn't vary the interest rate. I can get into that. You might say, well, it's like this is archaic and then it disappears with new markets. Not so. The market wasn't like that in the 17th century. Interest rates varied a great deal. Same in the 16th century, in the 15th century. You get this is not peculiar to France as well. You can find similar things in other parts of the world where loans essentially are rationed by, prices don't equilibrate supply and demand. It's done by information about collateral, creditworthiness. And this market sort of at a single price ended circa 1900 as a result of government intervention and the development of some new financial assets. And I'll talk about that. So let's talk about how this problem of asymmetric information was solved. First of all, the borrowers and lenders, it's highly unlikely that they knew one another. Why? Let's go back to 1740. We estimate, I mean, we can take our samples and estimate what's going on in France as a whole. And we estimate that in France as a whole, say, half the borrowers and lenders came from the same municipality, the same town. And so they were likely to know one another, as long as the town wasn't too big. That meant half were not from the same town. And if half were not from the same town, they'd be much less likely to know one another. And you might say, well, how about if they were not from the same town, but from nearby towns? Say, same canton. Well, a third of them were not from the same canton. That's a fairly sizable amount. And what does it mean if if you're from the same municipality, a big municipality like Paris? Again, you're unlikely to know one another. Let's look at, the fact is, lots of these borrower and lenders traveled to make the loan. One of them would travel to a notary who draw up the documents. Too few of them lived in the same place. And that was particularly true in small municipalities. Here's an example. In 1740, Jean Pajot goes from this little town, Bellac, it was about here, about 11 kilometers from his home, 11 kilometers to Bellac, to borrow 40 livres, that's about 2 or 3 months' pay for rural labor. We don't have his occupation, so we don't know what he did, but it's a sizable sum of money, from a Guillaume Raymond. And Pajot was not alone. Even in this town, other borrowers took out loans totaling 20,000 livres in 1740. There's a fair amount of lending going on. And lots of people were traveling. If we look in the 19th century, where there's a lot more data in these tax records about residents, they tended to leave out, often they would leave out information in 1740. You get a sense that, if you're living in if you're, say, look at a lender, depending on the population of his home, suppose it's under 20,000. So that's, say, from here on up. Essentially, in half the loans you make, or more, the borrower is going to come from another municipality. So you're not lending your neighbors. And travel was common, particularly for big loans where the cost of travel was low. Here's an unusual example. It's one of the largest loans we found. It was 1 million franc mortgage loan to bail out an investment banker named Bouot, who had an investment bank. He'd invested heavily in some new industrial enterprises. He was having trouble, so he called upon his wife's relatives who had a lot of real estate, asked them to mortgage the real estate so that he could borrow money in the hopes of saving the investment bank. So they lent to, I think it was 40-some Swiss lenders who sent an agent to Nuit Saint-Georges, it's in the area where you make Burgundy, and it was valuable real estate. They made the loan. It didn't keep him in business. He failed. The creditors were all repaid because it was all valuable collateral. His unsecured lenders lost 90% of what they'd lent. So anyway, that's an example. Not an unusual example, but again, you get a lot of travel. So how did these Swiss lenders find David Bouot? How did the lenders tell if borrowers were creditworthy? They're likely to know one another. You may say, well, maybe you just lend to relatives and friends, okay? That's going to severely limit lending. Or maybe you get a cosigner, someone to guarantee the loan. That's not happening. You can say, well, what about other forms of social capital? We investigate that's not happening either. Here's an example on family links. Here the fraction of loans that have contracts between family members. The maximum is in Paris about 8%, but even in 1740, but then it falls and it's very low. Same with cosigners. It's even lower. That's not the solution, okay? And in Paris, we'd earlier investigated whether people from the same profession, same parish, no, okay. Collateral is not a solution either, and I already talked about that. You don't have this effective lien registry. It's hard to tell if it's already been mortgaged. Yet the problem was solved. And the fact that there was so much travel is probably the best evidence. There's other evidence as well. If the problem hadn't been solved, you might have done the following. You'd be very leery of lending long-term to someone who lived far away, because you might want to watch over what's happening to the collateral. Is it a piece of real estate? Is it deteriorating? You have to travel to go inspect it. And so you might see that loans to distant borrowers would have a shorter maturity. There's no evidence of it. That's what this is a bad graph, but the bottom line of the graph is, I won't tell you who made it, it wasn't me. Not that I can think of anybody. Anyway, there's no relationship. That suggests this problem was solved. And you might say, particularly if you're a historian, is, what's the evidence? It's basically the travel. Now, and how did the reliable information about creditworthiness circulate between markets? It was by this exchange of information by notaries who matched up borrowers and lenders and referred borrowers and lenders to one another to facilitate matches. And implicitly, they were vouching for the creditworthiness of borrowers. They refer or match up. And the threat of the loss of referrals keep them from cheating other notaries. It was repeat business among the notaries, not among borrowers and lenders. Now, you might say, if you're a historian, don't you have any smoking gun direct evidence from the archives? Come on. Well, there is some. And when we first thought this up, we were sitting in Jean Roll's office at UCLA, and simultaneously, the three of us all had the same idea. Let's look for someone who had a lot of money, or a fair amount of money, and wrote lots of letters. And we all simultaneously thought of Voltaire, whose letters have been published, printed, indexed. We rushed up to the archives, started looking, and said, oh, this is wonderful. He's writing his notary and saying, hey, invest this for me. And not that that's every letter. No way. There are some other examples. One of these notaries decided to get involved in banking, and that's dangerous. He's taking money on deposit and lending out medium long term. He goes belly up. But in between, he's getting letters from people. There were some nuns north of Paris who said, we've heard you can find better loans for us than our local notary. Could you invest this large sum? He said, sure. I've got a deal for you. And then this was talked about by chroniclers at the time. So in the 18th century, there's some evidence. In the 19th century, the notaries preserved all the contracts they drew up. But they don't keep their accounts of their businesses or rarely, until late in the 19th century. And the ones that survive suggest this is going on as well. But in any case, it's the only way, we think, to explain the travel. Over half the loans involve travel for lenders when the lenders live in towns under 20,000. The lack of cosigners or family ties. They just couldn't have known whether. So, but the referrals are sort of interesting. The referrals and the communication was limited by the cost of travel. So we have a simple model, and I don't want to take too much time because we want to have some discussion, or maybe we don't. Maybe we want to have lunch. But you could think, well, suppose you have a notary sitting right here, and he may have 6 nearby notaries who are within, say, half a day's travel or something like that, to whom he could refer borrowers and lenders. Well, in theory, he could refer borrowers and lenders, all of them, and they each have their own notaries who are not the same as his. This notary has these 6. we have a little model that suggests he's only going to refer to a subset of his neighbors, not to all. Not to all 6, but only a proper subset, some number, 2, 3, something like that. He limits himself to a subset. That reduces the risk of cheating because it increases the repeat business between notaries. But it allows for more loans than sort of strict bilateral reciprocity. In other words, I'm this notary, I'm only going to deal with you. It gives him a little more flexibility, but not too much. And there's some evidence of this. What's the evidence? Well, if you look at the number of neighbors, say the number of neighbors within a fixed distance, that's a reasonable travel distance, what fraction of them get referrals? If you're going to refer to all the people within this distance, the fraction getting referrals should be along this line. It's not. It's way down here. Similarly, there's a better statistical test, and you could say, all right, if maybe you're just referring randomly, you don't care. If that's the case, for the number of referrals, it should be the share of neighbors who get referrals should be way out, should be high. It should be beyond one of these 2 curves. It's not. They're in here. So they're not being random in the referrals. They're limiting the referrals to a subset. That fits our model. And you can also eliminate simple reciprocity. I'm only going to deal with one notary back and forth. And because the referrals weren't symmetric. You might get more referrals from a set of notaries than you give them. And statistical tests rule out reciprocity. But that's what allows the notaries to do all this lending. And they facilitates lending across space. It's better than just matching up clients locally, better than reciprocity. And banks could not outcompete these notaries. They didn't get involved in the mortgage business. And we showed that in the book and in a paper we've published. In fact, notarial lending actually rose when banks entered a market. And so we get this large amount of lending. And I want to concentrate on the per capita stock of debt. What do I mean by stock? It's lending weighted by duration loans. That matters. Think of it this way. Suppose I was going to borrow 1,000 francs for 10 years. I could take out a 1,000 franc loan, pay it back with interest in 10 years. Or I could take out a 1,000 franc loan for 1 year, pay it back, and then renew the loan for another year and repeat that 10 times. If I were a historian reading along, I'd see 10 of these 1,000 one-year loans, but 1,000 10-year loan. And to get the stock of debt, you really have to weight by the duration, which is what we've done. So you might see a lot of short-term lending. A lot of our informal lending might be very short-term, but that's not going to add much to the stock because it doesn't have a heavy weight. If you look at the stock of debt down here, relative to GDP, it's, 16, 23, 27. These are mortgages. This is, again, comparable to the US in the 50s, and it remains large even in the late 19th century. And there are a lot of these loans. These are estimates for all of France. This is not just their sample. How many loans are outstanding? This is sort of the stock of the number. It's maybe how many loans are being made every year. Number of loans being made every year, it's, 500,000, between 500,000 and 250,000. The number of outstanding loans is close to 1 million or near, up 1.5 million or more. There are a lot of these loans. Now, what's the evidence that the banks could not outcompete? There are a bunch of regressions in the article, but here's a picture that tells you. If banks wanted to compete with the notaries, what would happen when a notary left office because of malfeasance? He went bankrupt. He stole people's money, something like that. You'd come in to invest the money in a loan. He said, give me the money. I'll find a borrower, and I'll call you up next week, and match you up. And then he'd disappear. There were some notaries who did this. Well, it wasn't, And when that happened, they'd remove the notaries. These are the number of notaries who were removed from office. If banks would be ready to move in when a notary had been disgraced and removed, you'd expect to see, if you had a lot of notaries removed, you'd see a lot of banks moving in these markets. You'd see a graph that would line up in this direction. You don't. There's no relationship. That's evidence that the banks were competing, and there's further evidence. Okay. Now, fine. I'm about to run out of time, so let me finish up by talking about what brought this notarial lending to an end. It survives for a long time. Several things happened. First of all, the government creates a mortgage bank that has government backing, the Crédit Foncier, in 1852. It has the monopoly on issuing mortgage bonds. There had been private attempts to create such a bank, and they'd all failed. Why? Because the bank didn't have the notary's information, so they got stuck with borrowers who were not creditworthy, and their mortgage bonds, they failed, okay? So it's got a monopoly on the issue of mortgage-backed securities, and it's got government backing for those securities. It's like, if you know the United States issuance, it's like Fannie Mae. Right? That's one thing. Then Napoleon creates a public lien registry. And that's one big change. So there's now a government lien registry that is going to be built up over time. You can start registering mortgages. So over time, you've got a record of past mortgages. And over time, anyone can go into this government registry and for a fee find out how much are there loans outstanding or has this property been mortgaged in the past. That's a source of information. It's not quite as good as what the notaries have because they can do that too and they have other sources of information about creditworthiness. At the same time, the government creates a bond market and sells its debt. In the 19th century, this is very safe. And so by the late 1800s, you've built up this public lien registry. There's verifiable information on creditworthiness and the value of collateral. And this government-backed loan bank starts targeting the best borrowers, really wealthy borrowers, primarily in Paris. They have very valuable collateral. And it starts giving them discounts on huge loans. So it enters the market, and it finally is the one bank that can compete with the notaries. But it has a limited clientele. And that leaves, what about the notaries? Well, that means that lenders start coming to them and saying, hey, how about you're making loans at 5%. That's pretty risky because the bank has maybe siphoned off your best borrowers. I'll be willing to make a loan at 5% or even more and have you arrange it, and I'm going to mix that with a safe government bond, since now you've got safe government bond. I have a portfolio of safe stuff and unsafe stuff. And so that causes this way of making loans to disappear. And then there's the last straw. The government starts subsidizing mortgages in the early 1900s. Even so, notaries are still providing a quarter of new mortgage debt as late as 1931. We go up to 1931. So just to finish up very quickly, this demise of notarial lending also ended credit rationing at a single interest rates. Again, this is not peculiar to France. There's a lot of this on the third of all loans on the US frontier in 1870 were at single interest rates, 50% in US cities after World War I. And it's because of the lack of information about collateral and the creditworthiness. Again, this wasn't the case in the 1600s. And I can talk about why it wasn't the case in the 1600s or the 1500s. But you can see the end of this if you look at the interest rate on loans. In 1865, this is one of our observational dates, all the loans are at 5%. And then by 1899, you're getting some loans at maybe even 3 1/4, some at 3.75, some at, 4.25, some at 4.5. Anyway, you're getting a mix of interest rates. And that's a real change. I'm about up with time. So again, there's more in this book, which is supposedly going to come out in 2019, more on the banking, more on legal origins, more on the effect of the French Revolution. But what I want to close with is, I think, a very important point. It'd be possible to do, you may think this is not valuable, but if you do, it'd be possible to do a similar research elsewhere. If you get a team of people, you can estimate total informal lending for a whole country if you've got some kind of records that makes the data collection possible. I think Sweden would be a good candidate. I mean, you've got these probate records, you have wealth registers, you have other evidence. That should be possible in Sweden. It should be possible in other places. And it might be worth thinking about doing this. You don't have to read every loan. You can sample. And if you sample intelligently, you can estimate what's going on in an entire economy. So that's the close. Great.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes and the floor is yours. I have some questions, but I take later on. There you are.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Great, fascinating, everything. So my question, you're probably typically asking about, so you've mentioned some hints about the 17th century, and you start in 1740. Is there any information, say, from your Paris data to figure out when that problem was solved?
Yes.
Yeah.
In Paris, we think it was solved in the 18th century. Well, solved via the notaries. They had done some of this beforehand, but actually the law affair, we would argue, spurs them to do more to arrange loans. Because during the law affair, which was an attempt to convert the government's debt into shares in a company, shares would be traded on an exchange and therefore would be liquid, and in a sense you could convert all the government's debt into equity and tradable equity and pay less interest on it because it was tradable, fine. But there was also rapid inflation. And so one of the things that happened during the law affair is that people paid off existing loans in worthless paper money. And they paid off many of them. So the notaries knew, they would go into a notary to pay off the loan, they knew who'd been ruined in this, who'd made out well. And they say, oh, okay, we've got some information about who's creditworthy. And there's a surge in what we think of as they're solving the problem after the law affair in the early 18th century. Okay? And there's signs because borrowers and lenders who came from the same parish, same profession, who were relatives, the fraction of such loans drops over time. Okay? That's.
Yes, please, Carol.
So thanks to the law affair.
Bill, can you give us a little better sense about what these mortgages are? That is, the general, in the early modern period, my impression is in most countries these mortgages are to get the cash, usually to get some cash, and they're not to purchase land, or they may, but that isn't necessarily, you can't assume that. And of course, over time, you have, in the 20th century, we think of mortgages to buy land or buy a house or whatever. And I'm not clear if that transition ever occurs here in France, or and why the government would get involved. Why did they want to get involved?
Okay. This is, the question is sort of what's the purpose of the loan? What's not the legal mechanism to mortgage to back it up, because that's a whole fascinating topic, the general mortgage, which wasn't worth much. But the purpose, the trouble with the tax records, they don't tell you much about the purpose. if anything at all. There are examples of these loans. They were used to finance one of the first French electric utilities in 1899, roughly, to finance steel mills or iron works in the mid-19th century. But 99% of the time, we have no idea what the purpose was. Our sense is, since these were large loans, that they were often involved in intergenerational transfers of property and things, setting up people. Or they might be used to buy a business, a government office or something like that. One of the things they were used for, and this we do know, was France farmed out a lot of its indirect taxes to so-called general farmers, who included famous people like the father of modern chemistry. What's his name? Senior moment here. Anyway, yeah.
Yep.
And the general farmers used the notarial market to raise money to finance their loans to the government. So it was an indirect way, particularly in the 18th century, to raise money for loans to the government. And then a direct way, in fact, because in the 18th century, the government sold its own loans via the notaries. I mean, all of this debt that we're talking about is private borrowers, not the government. So some of it was
Paris people are the government.
Paris people, but also other places, but particularly Paris. But even occasionally, there are a lot of construction or purchase property, building, a lot in the 19th century that we see of that. We have some, we think, in the 18th century as well. But again, we simply can't tell. That's one of the frustrations. And you might say, well, why not read the notarial records themselves? They don't tell you either. It's typically, borrower X is going to use this, or borrowers, Mr. and Mrs. Dupont are going to use this loan for their own purposes. What's that? Sometimes you get more detailed descriptions of what's involved, and there are loan conditions in the loan saying you have to buy, for the ironworks, you have to get insurance on the ironworks, fire insurance, and so on and so forth. But we simply can't tell.
You don't know that they change over time then. There's never to have amortized mortgages.
Oh, there is a change. Now, if we talk about the terms of the loan, there are some big changes that we talk about. In some sense, early on, you may have a couple kinds of lending. A poor, illiterate, no, not poor, an illiterate peasant comes in and have a notary, this is the medieval loan, let us call it that. That's unfair, but draws up a loan contract for a borrower or a lender who one of them can't read, all right? I mean, it's a small loan, year, 2 years, something like that. May not have explicit collateral, okay? Then over time, in the 18th century, and certainly you see development towards a standard loan of the sort you see in the United States in the 20th century. It's a loan for 5 years, 6 years, mortgage property with a balloon payment at the end. You pay back all the principal at the end. And that becomes increasingly common. So you see that. Or you might even have amortization. You'll pay back a fifth every year. The use of collateral changes. And the service for the illiterate begins to disappear. And that becomes minimal. Although even in the 19th century, in the south of France, there were notaries innovate by creating a new instrument. It's a bill of exchange often for illiterate farmers in the south of France, where illiteracy rates were high, that allows them to have a banker make a payment to a third party. And that is something different. So there's some innovation in the sort of instruments you see.
Innovation, yes. Market innovation. And another question? I have two questions still.
Yeah.
You take the first one. Meanwhile, I can take.
Thank you, Phil, for a very spirited presentation of a fascinating work, which I'm very much looking forward to read in its entirety. One thing makes me slightly uncomfortable is that you're easily switching between mortgage debt and other debt.
Yeah.
And if I understand your presentation correctly, most of what you're talking about is mortgage debt.
Most, yes.
And that means that the banks could only compete, only had problems to compete in the mortgage market. Now, that's a very specific market, and they may have had competitive advantages in other markets that you're not talking about.
Certainly. And so what I'm talking about, what I should have said is, these are by and large, it's secured credit. It's secured with some kind of collateral, typically mortgaged real property of some sort. But the banks did something quite different. They made payments and short-term loans, exactly. And they complemented one another.
Yeah, that's of importance if you want to enlarge this discussion and your findings towards what happens in developing countries, or what should happen in developing countries.
Yes.
Because it is a very specific market, and at least something we find in the Netherlands, the smallest of the informal credit market.
Yes, yeah.
So there is a lot more than this, and that's where banks might have a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So in some sense, these figures that I give you are underestimates of the total amount of debt. But you're absolutely right. And I think that's why when a bank entered, it didn't cause notarial lending to drop, because they're competing in different markets that do complement one another.
And the mortgage market in the Netherlands is the same. 60% is outside of the banks in the 1930s.
Where is the microphone? Either you speak up or you take the microphone. Maria, please.
Yes. Is it working? Yes. Thank you very much for a very fascinating paper. I thought it was particularly interesting to hear your discussion about these referrals. They seem to be a key mechanism. I think you're very right in pointing to their importance, but I wasn't quite sure of what the evidence of the referrals consisted in. So can you observe them directly, or do you have some kind of indirect indication of referrals?
The evidence is almost all indirect.
Yeah.
Is there any direct evidence? Fragmentary. You'll read in notarial accounts, when they survive, which is late 19th century, of other notaries having accounts with a given notary. And occasionally, stuck in the account books, you might find a letter saying, hey, I'm sending you business to do X. Mm-hmm. But that's extremely rare.
Yeah.
Maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 examples. But it's indirect. On the other hand, I have a lot of faith. You may say, well, it's easy for you to say. You've stuck you've invested in this argument, in the indirect evidence, because it's based on actual behavior. When you start thinking about this, how could they solve this? How could you solve the problem of matching up borrowers and lenders in a small town where there are just not many? I have a lender who comes in, wants to invest, and there are just not any borrowers. How did this, and then suddenly this lender goes to 20 kilometers away and makes a loan. Well, how did he know where to go? How did she know where to go? It boggles the mind that they all knew one another. And
yes, I agree, but I think it's at least theoretically possible that it worked by rumor and reputation.
It could, but it's hard to imagine that rumor and reputation would travel reliably that far, particularly if there are no other connections. That's the assumption, that this is the plausible explanation for what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We draw the line there. I'm sorry, because it's 12 o'clock and lunch is waiting for us. I must thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for.
I will not put any question, but just a remark, something to think about for all of us. What's the importance of these notariates in France? in relation to other countries. We had nothing like that in Sweden, and still we had more lending per capita than you had in France. So I think it is market aside.
Somehow it gets solved.